The term Metropolitan France refers to the part of France that is geographically in Europe. And while it's a commonly used term, it doesn't have any real administrative meaning in that the French overseas areas have the same administrative standing as the metropolitan ones. But it is important to the people of France, and was particularly important in the Second World War, as the liberation of metropolitan France meant the liberation of the homeland. And yet for many years, the liberation of the first territory of metropolitan France was forgotten history, even in France. In 2012, historian Corinne Varney noted that the liberation of Corsica, which occurred after the Italian surrender in 1943, was, until 2010, omitted from French history books. The fall of France occurred with stunning speed in the spring of 1940, the campaign lasting only approximately 6 weeks, with Italy only entering the battle in the last 2 weeks. On June 22, 1940, France and Germany signed an armistice, and armistice was signed with Italy on the 25th. The armistice was, in reality, a surrender, and the terms were harsh, but Hitler allowed armistice rather than total surrender for various reasons. There were some advantages to leaving a French government intact, including denying the use of French colonies to the Allies and eliminating the financial administrative burden of occupying all of France. Some 3/5 of metropolitan France, including its Atlantic ports, would be occupied by Germany, and a small part in the southeast occupied by Italy. But a zone in the south, called the Zone Libre, would not be occupied, but operated as a semi-independent, although collaborationist, French government, with the seat of government in the city of Vichy. The relatively free Zone Libre included the French-controlled Mediterranean island of Corsica. With an area of 3,368 square miles, Corsica is the fourth largest island in the Mediterranean. It is rugged, with nearly 2/3 of the island covered by mountains, and much of the island covered by uncultivated scrublands called maquis. Southeast of the French mainland, but west of the Italian peninsula, the coast is only 56 miles from Tuscany, while it's nearly 100 miles from the coast of France. It's separated from the larger Italian island of Sardinia by the narrow strait of Bonifacio. Corsica fell under Genoese control in the latter part of the 13th century, which, with the exception of a brief period during the 16th century, continued until an 18th century revolution resulted in an independent Corsican republic in 1755. But independence didn't last. The republic was overthrown by a French invasion in 1769. Corsica became a French department in 1796. Despite being a French department for over a century, the Corsican people were independent-minded, maintained a strong Italian heritage. Writing in a 2012 edition of the Journal of Contemporary History, Varley explains that relations between Corsica and France had been strained by the economic difficulties of the interwar years, and that there was a small but important autonomous movement, one that was being exploited by Italy. The fascist regime under Benito Mussolini believed strongly in irredentism, a movement inspired by the ancient Roman idea of Mare Nostrum, that the Mediterranean was our sea, to unify Italy with areas considered to be ethnically Italian, including Corsica. Varney writes that the outbreak of war between France and Italy in June 1940 brought into sharp relief the complexities of identity in Corsica. Many Corsicans shared both French and Italian heritage. On the other hand, Corsica's location meant that they saw a much greater risk from Italy than Germany. No fighting had occurred there in 1939 and 40, but the troops defending the island were preparing to defend from an invasion by Italy, not Germany. Bradley writes, for many Corsicans, viewing the war through the prism of their old rancor towards Italy, the wider conflict against Nazi Germany seemed distant and almost irrelevant. These were the complex attitudes and loyalties facing Corsicans when, in November 1942, the situation changed. On November 8th, the Western Allies began landings in French North Africa. Operation Torch had a significant impact on the people of Zone Libre. The landings rendered one of the most important original reasons for allowing the existence of an independent French government, denying the French colonies as a base for Allied operations, irrelevant, and a weak French state now represented a strategic liability to the Axis flank. In response, the Axis forces implemented Operation Case Anton, the military occupation of Vichy France. Emmanuel Sica of the Royal Military College of Canada writes in his 2016 book, Mussolini's Army in the French Riviera, the Italian Occupation of France, the Axis feared that the northern Mediterranean areas were next in line for an Allied invasion. Moreover, the Germans no longer trusted the Vichy regime. The German part of the operation included 10 divisions, while 150,000 Italian troops would occupy the Riviera. The action would result in the disbanding of the small Vichy French army and compelled French naval officers to scuttle the French fleet at Toulon to prevent it from falling into Axis hands. Notably, a few submarines managed to escape, heading to Morocco to join Free French forces, among them the submarine Casablanca. But the first action of Operation Case Anton, which began on November 11th, was the Italian occupation of Corsica. An initial occupation force of some 30,000, composed of elements of the Italian 7th Army Corps, including the 20th Infantry Division, landed at the island's principal port of Bastia, as well as at Ajaccio and Portvecchio. The website Codenames Operations of World War II notes that the Italian occupation of Corsica had already been strongly promoted by the Italian fascist regime as an element of its irredentist aims. At first, the occupation faced little difficulty. As the island was administered by the Vichy government, the landings were unopposed. And given the island's history, there was some collaboration with Corsican irredentists, including some in the Corsican military who saw the island as more Italian than French. But there was local opposition to the occupation, and partisan groups started to arise and gain support in rural areas. In an operation codenamed Secret Pearl Harbor on December 9th, agents of the Free French forces landed on the island, carried by the submarine Casablanca, to help coordinate partisan activities on the island. As the Italian presence increased, so did opposition. Eventually, the occupation force would number some 85,000, a massive number given the island's native population of only around 220,000. The partisans took the name of the scrubland where they generally operated, calling themselves the Maquis. As the resistance grew, the Allies started delivering arms via the Casablanca, and the occupiers started to become more repressive and violent. An October 1943 story in the Richmond Times-Dispatch reported, silent submarines nosed out of the Mediterranean. Tommy guns, hand grenades, and shoes floated ashore on rafts. British planes roared out of the night, flashing prearranged signals. Pilots pulled their levers, and a long flow of parachutes bearing arms drifted down to the waiting, anxious men below. Meanwhile, the Allies were having a discussion over plans for the island. In a 1993 report by the U.S. Army Center of Military History entitled Sicily and the Surrender of Italy, Lieutenant Colonel Albert Garland explains that, still disagreeing over the role of the Mediterranean campaign, the Allies hoped that the land invasion of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky and planned for July 1943, might knock Italy out of the war. At Casablanca, Allies were hopeful that an amphibious invasion of Sicily and a subsequent ground campaign on that island, together with intensified air bombardment of the Italian mainland, would produce Italian collapse. If it did not, some Allied planners suggested, Garland writes, that the Allies ought to seize Sardinia and Corsica. Conquest of the three islands and the subsequent bombing offensive against Italy, which can be conducted from bases in these islands, might be sufficient to drive Italy out of the war. While invasion plans were created, it was not to be. When Churchill and Roosevelt met in Quebec in August, codename writes, it had been decided that the islands of Sardinia and Corsica, parts of Italy and France respectively, should be recaptured only after Italy had left the war and the Allies had established air bases in the area of Rome, from which air support could be provided for these undertakings. There would be no Allied invasion. The defense of Corsica was left to the Maquis. But again, events affected the island. In the face of a deteriorating military situation, in July, Benito Mussolini had been removed from power. The new leadership, behind the back of their still allies in Nazi Germany, made ovations to the Allies for a ceasefire and armistice. The Armistice of Cassibile was signed on September 3rd. This decision would have a significant effect on Corsica. The Germans, who had caught wind of the negotiations, had established a plan to forestall the armistice and disarm the Italian armed forces, called Case Axa. While German forces moved to take control of most of the Italian-occupied zone, the Case Axa called for the removal of the garrisons from Sardinia and Corsica. This would seem to have freed Corsica. The Italians had surrendered. The Germans were evacuating. But instead, it placed them in dangerous crosshairs. The German garrison in Sardinia was to be evacuated through Corsica. Between September 8th and 15th, more than 25,000 troops, 4,600 vehicles, and 44 combat aircraft were moved across the straits from Sardinia to Corsica. The Italian troops were in disarray. Some defected to join the Maquis. Some decided to remain allied with the Germans, while the Italian commander, General Giovanni Mali, promised that the garrison would not oppose German actions. But when the Germans began forcibly disarming the Italian troops, Mali ordered them to resist. Many were captured before they could act, and more than 2,000 taken prisoner by the Germans. German naval infantry captured Bastia harbor on the 9th, resulting in a conflict with Italian naval units. The Italian torpedo boat Alicia escaped, and the next day attacked and damaged several German auxiliary vessels. The Maquis at the time numbered some 20,000, plus members of the Italian garrison loyal to the king who had joined them. Codenames explains, the liberation of Corsica began with an uprising ordered by the resistance on 9 September. The website of the French Ministry of Armed Forces explains that the decision by the Maquis to order a general uprising was because, in many areas around Europe and Africa, when the Italians had abandoned their positions, fast, brutal interventions were undertaken by the Germans. In Corsica, they risked having a German stranglehold on the island if they waited too long. The patriots were convinced that they were going to be up against a disciplined, well-trained enemy. But this was a problem for the Allies, who were not in a position to aid the resistance. Not only had Roosevelt and Churchill decided against an invasion of Corsica in August, but the Allies were on the verge of making landings on the west coast of Italy with Operation Avalanche. Codenames writes of the Maquis uprising. The Allies did not initially want such a development, for they preferred to focus their effort on the Avalanche invasion of Italy. But General Henri Girard, commander of French troops in the Mediterranean, became concerned that the Maquis uprising would spark a violent response by the Germans that would overwhelm the resistance fighters. He asked for permission to assist, but American General Dwight Eisenhower only acquiesced to using forces not involved in Operation Avalanche. Girard had available elements of the French First Army Corps, which had been raised in Algeria. But, codename notes, the French would have to find their own transport vessels, as all Allied capacity was currently involved in Avalanche. The effort to liberate Corsica was called Operation Vesuvius. Troops were ferried by remaining elements of the Free French Navy, with the first 109 troops arriving on the 11th, carried by the Casablanca. French destroyers and cruisers were also used to ferry troops. By September 27th, some 8,000 troops under the command of French General Henri Martin had been sent to the island. Martin met with Mali on September 17th and agreed to coordinate actions. The French Ministry of Armed Forces notes, the intervention, called Operation Vesuvius, hastily decided upon in Algiers, was well underway, and such disparate elements as the Corsican partisans, troops from the Army of Africa, and Italian troops were able to cooperate in a satisfactory manner, which was amazing given the circumstances. By this point, the Germans were actually conducting a fighting withdrawal, trying to control the island road network so that their troops could be evacuated. In the end, the combined Allied forces could not prevent the Germans from evacuation, but caused significant damage to them. The French Ministry of Armed Forces writes, the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division left the island, weakened by the destruction of some 100 tanks, 600 artillery guns, and 5,000 miscellaneous vehicles. Overall, the ministry estimates that the Germans suffered some 1,600 casualties, killed and captured. The island, and particularly the port of Bastia, suffered significant damage, both from the fighting and from Allied bombing the German positions. The ministry writes, there was considerable material damages on the combat sites. Many bridges were blown up, houses were destroyed, and Bastia was bombed by the Allies 5 times between 13 September and 4 October, not to mention the artillery fire. The partisans suffered 170 dead, approximately 300 wounded. At least 25 were killed by Germans in summary executions. But by October 3rd, Bastia was controlled by the Allies. As a contemporary British newsreel stated, the birthplace of Napoleon shook off its aggressors, and literally led the liberating army to victory. The victory was somewhat ironic, in that no Metropolitan French troops had been used in the effort to liberate the first part of Metropolitan France. The Free French forces all came from North Africa, where the Moroccan Goumiers, who are famed for their fighting prowess, fought heroically alongside Maquis fighters and Italians. Operation Vesuvius was central to a split between General Girard and Charles de Gaulle, who criticized Girard for acting without permission and for allowing socialists too large a role in the organization of the Maquis. Girard chose to retire in March 1944. The war wasn't over for the Corsicans. Some 12,000 volunteered to fight with Free French forces, and 17 different air bases were built on Corsica to be used to bombard Europe. So many American planes were flying in and out of Corsica that they likened it to a giant aircraft carrier that they dubbed USS Corsica. And while being the first territory of Metropolitan France to be liberated during the war is a matter of deep pride for Corsicans, it is still a matter of rather obscure history in the rest of France, where the Italian occupation doesn't fit well into the narrative of a grand battle against Nazi Germany. Varley concludes that, rather than developing a stronger French identity in opposition to Italy, that conflicting grievances and affinities developed a stronger Corsican identity in opposition to France. And conflict continues today over the cause of Corsican nationalism. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.